The first blow came at dawn on a Tuesday that would forever divide Michael Reynolds' life into before and after. He'd always been a man of routine, up at 5:30 a.m., coffee brewing, morning ritual as predictable as the sunrise. But this morning something was different. The light filtering through his kitchen window seemed raw and distorted, casting unfamiliar shadows across his meticulously maintained backyard. Michael's fingers tightened around his favorite ceramic mug, a gift from his late wife, Sarah, who had passed 3 years earlier. He'd kept their quarter-acre suburban lot exactly as she would have wanted, pristine, with carefully trimmed rose bushes, a small vegetable garden, and a lawn so perfect it could have graced the cover of a home and garden magazine. But now something was terribly, horrifyingly wrong. A massive wooden fence had materialized overnight, cutting a brutal line through his property. It wasn't just a few inches off. This was a wholesale invasion, sealing nearly 15 feet of land he tended with love and precision for decades. The fresh-cut lumber gleamed in the morning light, a raw wound across the landscape Sarah had helped design. Michael stepped onto his back porch, the morning dew soaking through his slippers. His mind raced through possibilities. Construction mistake, a surveying error, but deep down he knew better. This was deliberate. This was war. Frank Simmons, his neighbor, wasn't a man who believed in conversations or compromise. A retired military contractor with a reputation that made even longtime residents of Oak Ridge Estates whisper, Frank had always viewed the world as a territory to be conquered. At 68, with skin like weathered leather and eyes that had seen too much, he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who had spent decades believing might made right. Their history was complicated. When Sarah was still alive, they maintained a cordial, if distant, relationship. Polite nods during yard work, occasional small talk about neighborhood events. But after Sarah's passing, something had changed in Frank. His looks had become more predatory, more calculating. Michael had caught him measuring the property line more than once, always quickly turning away when Michael's gaze met his. The new fence wasn't just a boundary marker. It was a statement, a challenge, a declaration that Frank Simmons intended to take what he wanted, regardless of legal or moral constraints. Michael's hands, typically steady from years of precise architectural drafting, began to shake. Not from fear. No. This was something else. A slow-burning fury that started in his chest and radiated outward. He spent his entire career designing structures that respected boundaries that honored the delicate balance between human needs and environmental constraints. And now his own property had been violated with surgical precision. His mind flashed back to Sarah. Pick your battles carefully, she'd always said. But when you do fight, fight with everything you've got. This was going to be one of those battles. Michael Reynolds took a deep breath, set down his coffee mug, and pulled out his phone. He'd start by getting documentation, photographs, measurements, evidence. The war had begun. The morning air was thick with tension as Michael approached Frank Simmons' house. He'd spent hours preparing, scanning old survey documents, taking precise measurements, and documenting every inch of the unauthorized fence. His architectural background had taught him the value of meticulous preparation, and today, those skills would be his armor. Frank's house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, a fortress-like structure that seemed to bristle with an almost military precision. Landscaping so perfect it looked like it had been drawn with a ruler, windows reflecting the morning light like cold, watching eyes. Michael noticed something else. Security cameras mounted at strategic points, their lenses pointed not just at the front door, but sweeping across the entire property line. He took a deep breath and pressed the doorbell. The response was immediate but calculated. No rushed footsteps, no immediate welcome. Instead, a pause, long enough to suggest Frank was deliberately taking his time watching through the peephole or security system. The door opened precisely 6 inches, held by a chain. Frank's face emerged partially, one eye, part of his weathered cheek, a slice of gray hair. What? The word was more a challenge than a question. Michael's approach was surgical. We need to discuss the fence you've installed, he began, his voice calm but laden with a professional intensity he'd perfected during years of complex architectural negotiations. He spread the survey documents across the small space between them, letting the crisp white paper contrast against Frank's dark entryway. These clearly show the original property line, Michael continued. The fence you've erected is at least 15 feet past the legal boundary. Frank's response was not what Michael expected. Instead of denial or argument, a strange smile. More of a predatory smirk crossed his face. His free hand disappeared momentarily behind the door, and Michael caught a glimpse of something metallic. Was that a weapon? The air suddenly felt charged, electric with potential violence. You've got some nerve, Frank said, his voice a low growl that spoke of decades of military discipline and confrontation. Coming to my property, making accusations. But Michael had anticipated this. He brought his own protection, not a weapon, but something potentially more powerful, A body camera, discreetly attached to his collar, would record every moment of this interaction. Years of dealing with complex client negotiations had taught him the value of documentation. "I'm not making accusations," Michael responded, his tone remaining level. "I'm presenting documented evidence of an illegal land grab. The survey is clear. You moved the fence without any legal authorization." Frank's demeanor shifted. The casual dismissiveness vanished, replaced by a calculating intensity. Michael recognized the look. It was the same expression he'd seen in difficult contract negotiations, when someone realized they were cornered but wasn't ready to concede. "You want to play it this way?" Frank's voice dropped an octave, becoming a dangerous whisper. "Fine, let's see how you handle what comes next." The threat hung in the air between them. Not a direct physical threat, nothing that could be immediately construed as assault, but something more insidious. A promise of complications, of battles to come. As if on cue, Michael's phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. "This isn't over." Not by a long shot. Michael realized this was more than a simple property dispute. This was going to be a war, legal, personal, and potentially dangerous. Frank Simmons wasn't just a difficult neighbor. He was a strategist, and he just declared his first move. The game had begun. Michael Reynolds didn't believe in half measures. Within hours of his confrontation with Frank, he was sitting across from Jack Harrigan, a private investigator whose reputation in local legal circles was as sharp as his tailored suit. Harrigan wasn't just an investigator. He was a former homicide detective with a network that spread like underground routes through the city's most hidden corridors. "Frank Simmons," Jack muttered, spreading a series of files across the worn leather desk. Each file was a testament to meticulous research. Bank records, property transactions, military service documents. "He's not your average retired contractor." The story that emerged was far more complex than Michael had imagined. Frank's military background wasn't just a footnote, it was a labyrinth of classified operations and questionable conduct. Discharged from special operations with a record that was more redacted than readable, Frank had spent the last 2 decades building a network of influence that seemed to defy normal boundaries. Property records told a disturbing story. In 3 different states, Frank had been involved in property line disputes. Not occasional disagreements, but systematic encroachments that always seemed to follow the same pattern. A fence move here, a survey challenge there. Always just enough to push boundaries without triggering immediate legal action. "Look at this," Jack said, sliding a series of documents across the desk. Financial trails showed regular payments from obscure shell companies to local surveyors, municipal officials, even some county court clerks. It wasn't just about stealing land, it was about creating a system that made such theft possible. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about his property. This was about a calculated predator who had turned land acquisition into a twisted art form. The investigators' research went deeper. Frank's military record suggested a man who had spent years in psychological operations, someone trained to manipulate to pressure, to break down resistance through calculated psychological warfare. His methods weren't about brute force, but about finding and exploiting the smallest vulnerabilities. "He's got a pattern," Jack explained, pulling out a map marked with sticky notes and intricate connections. "Every property he's targeted follows a specific profile. Owners who are recently widowed or who have limited local family support. People who might find a legal battle too overwhelming." Michael thought of Sarah, of the years of loneliness since her passing. He realized he was exactly the type of target Frank had been hunting. But Michael wasn't like Frank's previous targets. An architect by profession, he understood systems. He knew how to build, how to analyze, how to deconstruct complex problems into manageable pieces, and now he was going to use those skills to fight back. The investigation revealed something else, a pending lawsuit in a neighboring county. Another property owner had tried to challenge Frank only to have the case mysteriously dismissed. The paperwork was a maze of legal technicalities that seemed designed to confuse and discourage. "We're not just dealing with a land grab," Jack said, his voice low and intense. "We're dealing with a systematic predator who's turned property manipulation into a business model." Michael's hands, typically used to drawing precise architectural plans, now clenched into fists. This was no longer just about a fence or a property line. This was about justice. About protecting not just his land, but potentially protecting other vulnerable homeowners from Frank's calculated attacks. "I want everything," Michael told Jack. "Every document, every connection. We're going to build a case so solid, so comprehensive, that Frank won't know what hit him." The investigation had transformed a personal dispute into something much larger. Michael Reynolds was no longer just a homeowner. He was becoming a crusader. The war was about to escalate. The police cruiser rolled up precisely at 2:17 p.m., its metallic blue paint gleaming under the late afternoon sun. 2 officers emerged, a study in contrasts. Detective Sarah Martinez, a 10-year veteran with the suburban precinct, moved with calculated precision. Her partner, Officer Ryan Collins, seemed younger, more uncertain, his movements betraying a freshness that suggested limited field experience. Michael had prepared meticulously. Spread across his kitchen table was a war room of documentation, survey maps, timestamp photographs, drone footage of the property line, and a detailed chronology of events. His body camera from the previous confrontation with Frank was charged and ready, his memory card a digital testament to the ongoing dispute. The initial moments were tense. Frank had called the police, claiming Michael was trespassing and threatening him. But Michael knew the script better than they might expect. "Mr. Reynolds," Detective Martinez began, her voice professional but guarded, "we received a complaint from your neighbor about a potential trespassing incident." Michael's response was immediate and calculated. "I have all documentation ready," he said, sliding a carefully organized folder across the table, including GPS-guided photographs, original property surveys, and video evidence of my interactions with Mr. Simmons. Officer Collins looked uncertain, glancing between Michael and the documents. Detective Martinez, however, had seen her share of neighborhood disputes. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the documents with a practiced intensity. The body camera footage was particularly damning. It captured Frank's barely veiled threats, the metallic glimpse behind the door, the text message that followed, a digital trail of intimidation. Michael had ensured every moment was documented with the precision of an architectural blueprint. "Mr. Simmons claims you approached him aggressively," Officer Collins stated, his hand resting uncomfortably close to his service weapon. Michael remained calm. "I have video evidence of our entire interaction. I can show you exactly what was said and done." As they reviewed the footage, the narrative began to shift. Frank's calculated attempt to paint Michael as the aggressor started to unravel. The body camera revealed a measured professional approach, Michael presenting documentation, Frank becoming increasingly defensive and threatening. Detective Martinez's demeanor changed subtly. What had begun as a routine complaint was transforming into something more complex. The documents Michael presented told a story far more nuanced than a simple property dispute. "These survey markers," she asked, pointing to a detailed map, "these are official county records." "Certified copies," Michael confirmed, obtained directly from the county surveyor's office. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Jack Harrigan's research came into play. Martinez recognized some of the shell companies from previous investigations, patterns of systematic property manipulation that suggested Frank was more than just a difficult neighbor. Officer Collins looked increasingly uncomfortable. What had seemed like a straightforward complaint was revealing layers of potential legal misconduct. "Mr. Simmons has filed similar complaints in other jurisdictions," Martinez said, more to herself than to Michael or Collins. "This looks like a pattern." The turning point came when they discovered the text message sent to Michael, a digital threat that added another layer of complexity to the case. Witness intimidation, potential harassment. What Frank had intended as a simple police complaint was becoming his own legal nightmare. As the officers prepared to leave, the message was clear. This was no longer just a neighborhood dispute. This was becoming a full-scale investigation, with Michael Reynolds transforming from a potential suspect to a key witness. The first battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Elena Rodriguez wasn't just a lawyer. She was a legal weapon forged in the crucibles of corporate litigation and neighborhood battles that lesser attorneys would have fled. Standing 6 feet tall in 4-inch heels, with a gaze that could cut through concrete, she listened to Michael's story with the intensity of a general planning a military campaign. Her office was a testament to her professional prowess. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, walls lined with law books and framed case victories that spoke of battles won against seemingly insurmountable odds. Michael spread out the documentation Jack Harrigan had uncovered, each file a potential missile in their legal arsenal. "This isn't just about offense," Elena said, her fingers tracing the complex web of financial transactions and property records. "This is about a systematic predator who's turned land acquisition into a criminal enterprise." The legal strategy began to take shape. They would file multiple actions: a civil lawsuit for property line violation, a motion for injunctive relief to force the removal of the illegal fence, and a potential criminal complaint for harassment and attempted land fraud. Elena's network of experts began to assemble like a specialized task force. A forensic surveyor who had testified in landmark property cases, a former municipal inspector with intimate knowledge of local zoning regulations. Each expert brought a piece of the puzzle, transforming Michael's personal battle into a comprehensive legal assault. The first strategic move was a cease and desist letter that read like a declaration of war. Meticulously drafted, it outlined every piece of evidence against Frank: the unauthorized fence, the pattern of similar disputes, the potential criminal implications of his actions. Each paragraph was a calculated blow designed to demonstrate that Michael was not a victim, but a formidable opponent. Frank's response came quickly and predictably. A counter letter filled with bluster and thinly veiled threats attempting to paint Michael as the aggressor. But Elena had anticipated this. Every word of Frank's response would become additional evidence, another nail in his legal coffin. "He's trying to intimidate you," Alina explained, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of legal combat. "But every communication is another piece of evidence. Every threat is another opportunity." The investigation Jack Harrigan had conducted proved invaluable. They discovered a pattern stretching back years. Frank had used similar tactics in 3 different counties, always targeting properties with owners who seemed vulnerable: widows, retirees, people less likely to mount a significant legal defense. Michael realized he was fighting not just for his own property, but for a broader principle. This was about protecting vulnerable homeowners from predatory land grabs. Alina began preparing for multiple legal fronts: a civil lawsuit that would expose Frank's systematic land acquisition strategy, a potential criminal investigation into fraud and harassment. Each document was a weapon, each deposition a potential turning point. "We're going to make an example of him," Alina said, her voice a mixture of professional determination and personal conviction. "Not just for you, but for every other homeowner he's tried to intimidate." The legal team assembled was nothing short of extraordinary. A forensic accountant began tracing Frank's financial transactions. A geographic information systems expert started mapping his historical property disputes. Each professional brought a specialized skill, turning Michael's personal battle into a comprehensive legal assault. As the sun set on Alina's office, Michael understood something profound. This was no longer just about a fence or a property line. This was about justice, about drawing a line in the sand and refusing to be intimidated. The legal war had begun, and Michael Reynolds was ready. The community meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the Oak Ridge Estates Community Center, a building that had witnessed countless neighborhood disputes, but never anything quite like this. Michael arrived early, accompanied by Jack Harrigan and Alina Rodriguez, their presence a calculated show of legal and investigative strength. The room filled quickly. At first, it was a trickle. Concerned homeowners, curious neighbors, local real estate agents. Then it became a flood. Every chair was filled and people began lining the walls. The air crackled with a mixture of tension, curiosity, and barely contained anger. Margaret Thompson, the neighborhood's longest residing homeowner, was the first to speak. A retired schoolteacher in her 70s, she commanded respect simply by clearing her throat. "Frank Simmons has been a problem for years," she began, her voice steady and strong. "But nobody's ever had the courage to stand up to him." One by one, stories emerged. A retired couple whose property line had been subtly altered. A young family who'd been intimidated into silence. A widow who'd nearly lost a portion of her late husband's legacy to Frank's calculated land grabs. Alina Rodriguez stood, her presence immediately drawing all eyes. "This isn't just about one property," she declared. "This is about a systematic pattern of intimidation and land theft that has gone unchecked for years." Jack Harrigan began presenting the evidence, a carefully curated presentation that mapped out Frank's history of property disputes. Each slide was a punch, each document a revelation. The room grew quieter with each passing moment, shock replacing initial curiosity. The local real estate agent named Robert Martinez stood up, his face pale. "I've seen these tactics before," he admitted. "There are buyers who specialize in these kinds of incremental land grabs. They target properties with unclear boundaries or owners who might not fight back." The meeting transformed from a neighborhood gathering into something more significant. It was becoming a movement. Local media caught wind of the story. A reporter from the county newspaper arrived midway through the meeting, her notebook already filling with explosive revelations. The local news station sent a camera crew, sensing a story that was far more than a simple property dispute. Michael found himself at the center of something much larger than his personal battle. He was no longer just a victim. He had become a catalyst. The community began to organize. A WhatsApp group was created. Legal resources were shared. People who had been silent for years found their voices. Alina Rodriguez helped them understand their rights, providing guidance on documenting property lines, understanding survey markers, and protecting their property. Frank Simmons, who had been watching from the shadows, suddenly found himself exposed. The predator had become the prey. Social media exploded with the story. A local activist created a hashtag Oak Ridge Justice, that began trending in the county. Screenshots of Frank's previous property disputes were shared. His tactics, once hidden, were now fully illuminated. The local county commissioner, who had long ignored similar complaints, found himself under increasing pressure. Investigations were demanded. Oversight was called for. By the end of the night, Michael realized something profound had happened. What had started as a personal battle had become a community movement. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years but never truly connected were now united with a common purpose. "This isn't just about a fence," Elena whispered to Michael as the meeting wound down. "This is about community, about standing up to bullies, about protecting what's rightfully yours." The room was electric with possibility. Frank Simmons had made a critical mistake. He had underestimated the power of a community that finally decided to fight back. But war had entered its most dangerous phase.